In a quiet Georgia town, a former London police officer built a new life with a woman who thought she'd found love. But behind the charm and uniform was a secret, an affair, a lie, and a deadly plan. When truth threatened his comfort, love turned into murder. It began in Warner Robins, Georgia, a quiet, middle-class town known more for its airbase and family neighborhoods than for violent crime. But behind one of those front doors, a story of lies, manipulation, and murder was taking shape. The man at the center of it all was Brian McManus, a 57-year-old former police officer from London, England. On paper, he looked respectable, even disciplined. He had served in law enforcement for nearly 2 decades before leaving the force. But people who once knew him in the United Kingdom remembered a different side. A man accused of harassment, someone who misused authority, someone who didn't handle rejection well. When McManus arrived in the United States, he was looking for a new start. He didn't have family here, and his visa status was uncertain. In 2022, he joined Tinder, the dating app, and that's where he met Lucille and McManus, a 63-year-old grandmother from Georgia. Lucille had lived in Warner Robins most of her life. She was known among her neighbors as warm, outspoken, and deeply devoted to her family. She had worked various jobs through the years, mostly clerical and retail positions, and in her later years took pride in helping raise her granddaughter and 2 great-grandchildren who lived with her. Their relationship moved fast, too fast, friends would later say. Within 3 months of meeting, Brian proposed. He told Lucille he loved her accent, her kindness, and how she made him feel at home in a new country. Lucille, divorced for many years, was flattered by the attention. She accepted his proposal. In December 2022, they married, and Brian soon began the process to secure permanent residency, a U.S. green card, through his new wife. At first, everything seemed calm. The couple bought a small home in Warner Robins, and Brian quickly settled into domestic life. To outsiders, it looked like a late-in-life love story. But behind closed doors, things were not as they seemed. Brian didn't work steadily and seemed restless. He spent hours on his phone, often taking it with him even into the bathroom. He also traveled alone to Florida several times, claiming he needed space or wanted to visit friends. Lucille trusted him at first, though she noticed odd behavior. Then came the message, the moment that cracked everything open. One night, while Brian was away, Lucille picked up his phone and saw a text meant for another woman. It was affectionate, unmistakably romantic. The message ended with words no wife could ignore. Brian had mistakenly sent it to her instead of his mistress. Lucille confronted him when he returned home. Neighbors would later recall hearing shouting that night. Lucille's trust was destroyed. In the days that followed, she began to piece things together. She found other messages, hotel receipts, and social media exchanges confirming Brian's affair with a woman living in Florida. She also began to suspect that her marriage had been part of something bigger, a plan to secure American residency rather than a genuine relationship. The discovery infuriated her. Lucille confided in a few close relatives and told them she was planning to report Brian to immigration authorities. She said she believed their marriage was a sham and wanted it legally investigated. She also considered filing for divorce. Friends described her as hurt but determined. She felt she had been used. Brian, meanwhile, became defensive. He denied everything, begged for forgiveness, then turned cold. He began sleeping in another room. By early November 2023, tension in the house had reached its peak. Their arguments were frequent and loud. Family members who lived with Lucille said the atmosphere felt dangerous. Lucille reportedly told her granddaughter that she was afraid of Brian, that she no longer trusted what he might do. Yet she stayed, possibly hoping to resolve the situation legally before asking him to leave. The day of the murder, November 24, 2023, started like any other. The couple's granddaughter had left earlier in the day, and the house was quiet. Investigators would later determine that Lucille had just stepped out of the shower when the attack began. Brian struck her in the head with a blunt object, believed to be a rubber mallet. Then, as she fell, he strangled her. The autopsy later confirmed both blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. After the killing, Brian tried to cover his tracks. He cleaned himself up, changed his clothes, and took his dog for a walk, carrying his phone and the murder weapon. Cameras from nearby houses recorded him walking toward a drainage ditch, where police later found a discarded hammer-like object and a phone case. Investigators believe he dumped his phone and any evidence linking him to the crime. When he returned, Brian called 911. The call came in around 8:30 p.m. He sounded calm, telling the dispatcher he had just returned home from walking his dog and found his wife dead. He claimed she might have taken her own life. When first responders arrived, the scene didn't match his story. Lucille was lying naked on the bed, her body bruised, her head bleeding. There was no sign of a firearm, no note, and no evidence of self-harm consistent with suicide. The room was oddly clean, except for a few blood spots near the headboard. Officers noted Brian's detached demeanor. He wasn't crying or panicking. He simply stood nearby, occasionally answering questions in short, clipped sentences. Detectives from Warner Robins Police Department began to see inconsistencies almost immediately. Brian's timeline didn't line up with phone records or witness accounts. Neighbors recalled not hearing a dog bark during the time he claimed to be out walking. Surveillance footage from a nearby store showed him walking calmly, carrying something that looked like a towel or bag, possibly containing the murder weapon. The next day, police questioned him again. His story changed. He said Lucille had been depressed and possibly hit her head in the shower. Later, he suggested someone else had entered the house and attacked her. When investigators pressed further, he claimed a robbery might have gone wrong. Each version contradicted the physical evidence. Detectives obtained a search warrant. They found freshly washed clothes in the washing machine, and forensic testing revealed traces of Lucille's blood on a pair of Brian's shoes. A neighbor's doorbell camera provided key footage of Brian leaving the house minutes after the estimated time of death and returning less than an hour later. In the days following Lucille's death, the community in Warner Robins was stunned. People described her as generous and full of life. Family members held vigils and spoke openly about their disbelief that the man she had married could have done this. Brian was arrested shortly after, charged with murder and evidence tampering. The case drew national attention because of his background as a former UK police officer and the allegations of immigration fraud. For investigators, the motive became clear as they pieced together the story. Lucille's threat to expose the marriage as fake could have jeopardized Brian's residency status. She was the only person who could directly confirm whether their union was genuine. Her death conveniently removed that threat. By the end of 2023, Brian McManus sat in a Georgia jail cell, awaiting trial. Prosecutors began building a strong case, backed by forensic evidence, surveillance footage, and testimony from Lucille's relatives. The story of a man who once enforced the law, but now stood accused of breaking it in the most brutal way had begun to unfold, and the truth behind his calm exterior was darker than anyone had imagined. The weeks after Brian McManus's arrest turned Warner Robins into the focus of national attention. Reporters from Georgia and the UK came looking for answers. How could a former London police officer, trained to uphold the law, end up accused of killing his wife in a quiet American town? The story felt like something out of a thriller, an ex-cop, a green card marriage, a double life, and a brutal killing staged to look like suicide. But for Lucille's family, it wasn't a story. It was a painful reality that tore their lives apart. Detectives continued their investigation carefully. They began reconstructing Brian's timeline on the night of November 24th, using security footage, phone data, and neighborhood cameras. They found gaps in his movements that didn't make sense. His phone had been turned off for nearly an hour around the time of Lucille's death. When it was turned back on, data showed that several files and messages had been deleted. Forensic experts later retrieved fragments of texts and browser history showing searches for how long does DNA last on clothes and how to clean blood stains quickly. Investigators also learned more about his life before coming to Georgia. Through cooperation with UK authorities, they obtained his employment history from the London Metropolitan Police. He had served for nearly 17 years before being dismissed for misconduct. Several women had accused him of harassment and abuse of power. Although he was never criminally charged, his career ended quietly under disciplinary review. Former colleagues described him as manipulative and controlling, someone who resented authority when it didn't favor him. That pattern of control seemed to continue in his marriage to Lucille. Family members told police that Brian often isolated her, monitored her phone, and became angry when she spent time with her granddaughter. He didn't have close friends in Warner Robins and avoided local gatherings. Some neighbors thought he was simply private. Others recalled seeing him pace outside at night, smoking alone, always appearing tense. When the case went to the Houston County District Attorney's Office, prosecutors started building a narrative that combined jealousy, self-preservation, and deceit. They argued that Brian had everything to lose. If Lucille reported the sham marriage to immigration officials, his residency could be revoked, and he might be deported back to the UK facing that risk and the humiliation of public exposure. He chose to silence her. Detectives also discovered that his affair with a Florida woman was ongoing even after Lucille's death. During his time in custody, he had tried to contact her through a friend, instructing her not to speak to police. The messages were intercepted. The prosecution now had evidence of motive, premeditation, and an attempt to obstruct justice. Meanwhile, Lucille's family struggled to process their loss. Her granddaughter, who had been living in the home, gave emotional testimony to investigators about the final days before the murder. She said her grandmother had told her, "I'm going to tell the truth. I don't care what happens to him." Those words became an important piece of the prosecution's story, Lucille's final stand for her dignity and honesty. As the trial date approached in 2025, the defense team for Brian McManus argued that the case was circumstantial. They claimed there was no direct eyewitness to the killing and no clear physical evidence proving intent. His attorney painted him as a man overwhelmed by emotional turmoil, a foreigner misunderstood in a small American town. But prosecutors had more than emotion on their side. They had science. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation processed the evidence from the McManus home. Forensic testing confirmed that the blow to Lucille's head matched a mallet found in a nearby drainage ditch. DNA on the handle matched Brian's profile. Blood spatter analysis showed a pattern consistent with an assault while the victim was standing, not lying down, contradicting the suicide story. The medical examiner's report described bruising on Lucille's neck that could only have come from manual strangulation. During pretrial hearings, the court also reviewed surveillance videos that caught Brian walking his dog minutes after the estimated time of death. The footage showed him calm and composed, carrying something white in his right hand, later determined to be a towel used to clean blood. Cell tower records placed him near the ditch where the weapon was recovered. Investigators testified that his behavior was calculated and deliberate. Public interest in the case grew as new details emerged. Reporters described McManus as the ex-cop turned killer and the husband who couldn't bear exposure. Old footage from his days in the London police surfaced, showing him in uniform, smiling beside his colleagues. The contrast between that image and his current reality fascinated the public. He had gone from enforcing the law to being the subject of it. In court documents, prosecutors included excerpts from Lucille's text messages in the days before her death. She had texted a close friend saying, "I found out he's cheating. I'm going to tell immigration everything." Another message read, "If anything happens to me, it's Brian." Those texts were time-stamped just 48 hours before she was killed. Detectives also found signs that Brian had planned parts of his cover-up. On his laptop, they discovered an online order for cleaning supplies and new clothing made days before the murder. They also found a note on his phone written in his draft messages folder, which read, "I found her like this. She must have done it to herself." Prosecutors believed it was a script he intended to use when calling 911. During his time in jail awaiting trial, Brian spoke little. He refused interviews and denied all allegations when questioned. According to officers at the Houston County Detention Center, he spent most of his time reading or writing letters that were never sent. He often told other inmates he was framed, insisting Lucille had fallen and that police wanted to make an example of him. But those claims didn't hold up against the evidence. The trial began in July 2025 in the Houston County Superior Court. The courtroom was packed with reporters, law students, and true crime enthusiasts who had followed the case for 2 years. On one side sat Lucille's family, her granddaughter, her sister, and a few close friends, quiet but visibly emotional. On the other, Brian appeared detached, his expression blank as testimony unfolded. The prosecution opened by laying out the motive clearly: fear of deportation, anger over exposure, and the loss of control over his carefully built image. They described him as a man who married for convenience, not love, and killed for self-preservation. They showed the jury photos of the crime scene, the mallet, and Lucille's injuries. The evidence spoke for itself. Witness after witness painted a consistent picture. Lucille's granddaughter described hearing arguments about papers and immigration. A neighbor recalled seeing Brian cleaning his porch late that night, an odd thing to do after finding one spouse dead. A forensic pathologist walked the jury through the physical injuries, using medical slides and diagrams. The defense tried to counter by suggesting Lucille might have fallen and hit her head, and that the strangulation marks could have come from resuscitation attempts. But the medical examiner firmly dismissed that theory. The prosecution also called digital forensic experts who explained how Brian had deleted files and turned off his phone during the critical window. Each day, the story unfolded piece by piece, and by the second week, the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Reporters covering the trial noted that Brian rarely looked at the jury. He sat stiffly, taking notes, sometimes shaking his head as witnesses spoke. The judge occasionally reminded him to remain silent when he muttered under his breath. Outside the courthouse, people gathered holding photos of Lucille. Local residents spoke to the press about how her death had shaken the community. They said she represented the best of Warner Robins, kind, trusting, and devoted to family. For them, the trial wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoring her voice. By the end of the second week, both sides rested their cases. The prosecution had built a timeline supported by forensic evidence, digital trails, and motive. The defense, though persistent, had little to counter with. The jury listened intently, knowing the next phase would determine whether Brian McManus would spend the rest of his life behind bars or walk free. As the courtroom prepared for closing arguments, the atmosphere was heavy. The story that began with a whirlwind romance on a dating app had spiraled into betrayal, fear, and death. What had started as a marriage built on lies was now ending in a public reckoning. All that remained was for the jury to decide what justice looked like for Lucille and McManus, and whether her husband's version of events would hold up under the truth. The jury room doors closed with a soft thud, leaving behind the silence of a courtroom that had lived and breathed tension for 2 weeks. Inside, 12 jurors reviewed every piece of evidence they had seen and heard. The story was as grim as it was clear: a marriage built on deceit, a woman's courage to speak out, and a husband's desperate attempt to silence her. Outside, the hallways were filled with whispers and pacing footsteps. Lucille's family waited, gripping photographs and memories, holding on to the hope that justice would speak for her now. Brian McManus sat motionless at the defense table. Dressed neatly, his posture stiff, his expression blank, he looked less like a man awaiting a life-or-death verdict, and more like someone watching a play he didn't care to understand. His attorney leaned close, whispering, but Brian didn't answer. For all the control he once had, he was now powerless, surrounded by deputies ready to take him back to his cell the moment the verdict was read. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. When they returned, every face carried the weight of certainty. The foreperson handed the verdict form to the bailiff. The judge's voice echoed softly as he asked, "Have you reached a unanimous decision?" The answer came steady and firm. Yes. The courtroom stood. Lucille's granddaughter gripped her sister's hand so tightly it trembled. The clerk read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Brian McManus, guilty of malice murder." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and irreversible. Lucille's family broke down in tears. The prosecutor exhaled, his jaw tight. Brian didn't move. He blinked once, slowly, then looked straight ahead. There was no outburst, no reaction, only a quiet stare, the same unsettling calm that had followed him since the day of his arrest. The judge turned to the jury to thank them, then immediately addressed the sentence. The prosecutor stood and requested life without parole, calling the killing a cold act of control, a punishment delivered because Lucille McManus dared to stand up for herself. He reminded the court that Lucille had been vulnerable but brave, that she discovered the truth about her husband's affair and fraudulent marriage, and that she paid for her honesty with her life. When given the chance to speak, Brian rose. He looked thinner than he had months earlier, his voice low and flat. "I did not kill my wife," he said. "I loved her, and I've been wrongfully convicted." He paused, as though waiting for a response. No one spoke. The silence from Lucille's family was louder than any words. The judge, unmoved, told him that his actions, not his words, defined him. He called the murder premeditated and cruel. Then he pronounced the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sound of the gavel marked the end. Deputies stepped forward and took Brian into custody. He turned once toward the gallery, his expression unchanged, and was led out in handcuffs. For the first time in almost 2 years, Lucille's family felt the weight of justice, but not relief. Justice didn't bring her back. It only ensured that her story wouldn't end with his lies. Outside the courthouse, cameras clicked as the district attorney spoke to the press. He described the case as one that revealed how manipulation, control, and fear can live quietly behind closed doors. He praised the investigators and forensic experts whose persistence had broken through Brian's attempts to hide his crime. He also read a statement from Lucille's granddaughter, who couldn't speak publicly that day. "My grandmother was kind and trusting. She loved deeply and believed people were good. That trust cost her everything. But she never stayed silent, and that's why the truth came out." In the weeks that followed, news outlets from both Georgia and the United Kingdom covered the story. They focused on Brian's past, a former London police officer, dismissed after years of misconduct allegations. Former colleagues described him as controlling and arrogant, someone who liked authority but resented accountability. His fall from officer to murderer became a symbol of how easily control can turn into violence when power is threatened. British tabloids ran headlines like "From Badge to Bloodshed" and "Ex-Cop's Green Card Killing." Back in Warner Robins, the McManus home sat empty, its windows shuttered and its yard overgrown. The granddaughter and her children had moved out shortly after the murder, unable to stay in the place where it happened. Neighbors still slowed their cars when they passed by, remembering Lucille's laughter, her front porch chats, and the way she looked out for everyone on the street. They couldn't reconcile that warmth with the horror that unfolded inside those walls. Investigators later revealed just how methodical Brian had been. Forensic specialists recovered deleted searches from his phone showing he'd looked up how to clean blood, how to fake a suicide, and what happens during police questioning. He had bought new clothes and cleaning supplies just days before the murder. On his phone's notes app, they found a draft of what appeared to be a prepared 911 statement. "I found her like this. She must have done it herself." The same words he later told police. In prison, Brian remained as distant as ever. Officers at the state correctional facility described him as quiet, polite, and emotionless. He read constantly, avoided conversations, and refused interviews. He never confessed. He never apologized. When the subject of appeal came up, he initially refused to sign the paperwork. Over time, he became just another inmate, another name in the system. Lucille's family tried to rebuild their lives. Her granddaughter, who had testified during the trial, became an advocate for domestic abuse awareness in her community. She spoke at local events, telling her grandmother's story to help others recognize emotional manipulation and isolation. "It doesn't always start with violence," she told one audience. "It starts with control. It starts when you stop feeling safe in your own home." The case became a lesson in how appearances can deceive. Brian had seemed respectable, a former police officer, a foreign gentleman, well-spoken and calm. But underneath was a man driven by ego and fear. He couldn't stand losing control, and when Lucille threatened to expose him, he chose murder over shame. For investigators, it was a reminder that manipulation can look like love until it turns deadly. Over time, the community in Warner Robins began to honor Lucille's memory. Her friends organized a candlelight vigil every November, marking the day she was killed. They called it a light for Lucille, and each year, they spoke her name aloud so it wouldn't fade. For many, her story symbolized strength, the courage to confront deceit even when the danger was close. Reporters revisiting the case often noted how unusual it was for a man with police training to commit such a calculated murder and yet leave behind so much evidence. Investigators later said his arrogance had blinded him. He believed he could outsmart everyone, that his knowledge of procedure would cover his tracks. But in the end, it was that overconfidence that destroyed him. The very systems he once trusted to protect him became the ones that exposed him. Years later, Brian McManus remains in a Georgia state prison, serving his life sentence. He receives no visitors. His name occasionally appears in small legal filings, letters, requests, minor petitions. But no major appeal has ever moved forward. The outside world has moved on, but for Lucille's family, the absence remains. They still visit her grave on holidays, bringing flowers and speaking softly to her memory. They say she finally got her peace, even if it came too late. The case of Brian McManus stands as one of those stories that stays with people not just because of its violence, but because of what it revealed about deception and control. A man who once wore a badge crossed the line he once swore to uphold. A woman who wanted love found herself in the path of danger she couldn't see coming. In the end, truth did what it always does. It surfaced, steady and undeniable. Lucille's voice was silenced in life, but through the justice that followed, it spoke again, clearly, powerfully, and finally, for the last time. In a quiet Illinois suburb, a decorated police sergeant seemed untouchable, until his wives started turning up dead or disappearing. Behind the badge and charm hid a secret life of control, fear, and murder. This is the chilling true story of Drew Peterson, the cop who believed he could outsmart justice. In the quiet suburban town of Bolingbrook, Illinois, life often moved at an easy pace. Families knew each other, neighbors waved as they passed, and local police officers were familiar faces in the community. Among them was Drew Peterson, a confident, well-known sergeant in his 50s who seemed to have everything in order. He was the kind of man people described as charming and easy to talk to. But beneath that friendly image was a side few truly understood, a man whose personal life was chaotic, controlling, and eventually deadly. Drew Peterson had been married 4 times. His first 2 marriages ended in divorce, but it was his 3rd marriage, to Kathleen Savio, that would later expose the darkness behind his calm smile. Kathleen, often called Kay, was a strong, determined woman in her early 40s. She worked hard to build a good life for herself and her children. Friends described her as practical and independent, someone who didn't back down easily. She met Drew when both were still young, and for a while, their relationship seemed loving and full of promise. They married in 1992 and built a comfortable life together in Bolingbrook. As the years passed, Drew's career advanced. He was respected within the Bolingbrook Police Department, known for his experience and discipline. But at home, things were far from steady. Kathleen began to notice a darker side of Drew. He could be controlling and jealous. Arguments between them became frequent, and friends recalled that Kathleen often sounded anxious when she talked about her marriage. By the late 1990s, she told several people that she feared Drew's temper and didn't feel safe around him. Their marriage continued to deteriorate. Kathleen tried to focus on raising their 2 sons and maintaining a sense of normal life. But Drew had already started seeing another woman, Stacy Callis, a 19-year-old young woman who lived nearby. The age difference between Drew and Stacy was startling. Drew was 47 at the time, and Kathleen felt humiliated when she found out about the affair. That discovery marked the breaking point. Their marriage crumbled completely, and by 2003, Kathleen and Drew were officially divorced. The divorce process was tense. There were ongoing arguments about money, property, and custody of the children. Kathleen told friends and family that she was terrified of her ex-husband. She said Drew had warned her that she would not live long enough to see their divorce settlement finalized. Still, she tried to move on. She remained in her Bolingbrook home, only a few doors down from Drew's new house, where he now lived with Stacy, who soon became his fourth wife. It was an odd arrangement, two women linked to the same man, living within sight of each other. But Drew insisted it was best for the children. Kathleen confided in her friends and relatives that she was afraid Drew would kill her. She documented some of her fears in letters and conversations. Those close to her noticed she was becoming increasingly anxious. Yet, she was also trying to regain control of her life. She was focused on her kids, her work, and her future. Then, one weekend in March 2004, everything changed. On March 1, 2004, police were called to Kathleen Savio's home. A neighbor had become concerned after not seeing her for days and noticing her mail piling up. Inside the house, they found Kathleen dead in her bathtub. Her body was lying face down, and her hair was still wet. There was a small amount of water in the tub and bruising on her body. The initial police report classified her death as an accidental drowning. Investigators concluded she must have slipped, hit her head, and drowned. Drew Peterson, the ex-husband and a seasoned police officer, quickly arrived at the scene. He appeared calm, telling authorities he had been home with Stacy and hadn't seen Kathleen for several days. Despite some unusual details, no one pressed too hard at first. After all, Drew was one of their own, a respected officer. The medical examiner ruled Kathleen's death accidental, and the case was closed. No one imagined that years later it would reopen as one of Illinois' most controversial murder cases. In the months following Kathleen's death, Drew Peterson continued his life with Stacy. She had now become his new wife, and together they were raising their blended family. To neighbors, they seemed happy, though some noticed that Stacy looked tired and withdrawn. Friends described her as sweet, soft-spoken, and deeply devoted to her children. But behind closed doors, her marriage was starting to resemble Kathleen's. Drew was much older than Stacy, and his controlling behavior soon surfaced again. He monitored where she went, who she spoke to, and even her phone calls. Stacy's family, especially her sister Cassandra, worried about her. They encouraged her to leave Drew, but she often said she didn't know how. She felt trapped. Meanwhile, Drew appeared completely comfortable, showing no signs of guilt or distress about Kathleen's death. Life went on quietly in Bolingbrook until October 2007. That fall, the calm suburban neighborhood once again found itself at the center of a storm. Stacy Peterson vanished. Drew claimed that she left him and ran off with another man, leaving behind her two young children. He told police she had called him to say she needed time alone. But her family immediately doubted that story. Stacy would never have abandoned her kids, they said. As days turned into weeks, the media descended on Bolingbrook. The search for Stacy Peterson became national news. Reporters crowded outside Drew's home, helicopters hovered above, and volunteers joined massive search efforts across Illinois. Drew, instead of staying quiet, began doing television interviews. He appeared calm and confident, even joking at times. The more he spoke, the more the public turned against him. People started asking questions, not just about Stacy's disappearance, but about what had really happened to Kathleen Savio. The case took a dramatic turn when investigators began re-examining Kathleen's death. The story of her accidental drowning no longer fit the facts. Detectives spoke with people close to both women and learned that Kathleen had repeatedly said she feared Drew would kill her. Friends described how she had injuries before she died, and how her divorce from Drew had been filled with threats. Authorities decided to exhume Kathleen Savio's body in 2007 for a new autopsy. What they found changed everything. The second autopsy revealed that her death could not have been accidental. She had bruises on her body, cuts on her head, and signs of a violent struggle. The conclusion was clear. Kathleen Savio had been murdered. This discovery transformed what had been a missing person investigation into a full-blown homicide case. Detectives now believed they were dealing with a man who might have killed more than once. Drew Peterson, once a trusted officer and neighbor, was now the prime suspect in two potential crimes: the mysterious disappearance of Stacy Peterson and the murder of Kathleen Savio. The investigation grew larger. Police searched Drew's house, his cars, and the nearby canal where volunteers thought Stacy's body might have been dumped. They spoke to his stepbrother, Thomas Morphy, who later claimed Drew had asked him for help moving a heavy container the night Stacy disappeared. Thomas said the container felt like it held something the size and weight of a human body. That statement only deepened suspicions. By the end of 2007, the town of Bolingbrook was no longer just a quiet suburb. It had become the focus of national attention, a place where a respected police sergeant was being accused of killing one wife and possibly another. The investigation into Drew Peterson had only just begun, and the truth about what really happened to Kathleen Savio was finally starting to surface. After Kathleen Savio's body was exhumed and re-examined, everything that had once seemed settled in Bolingbrook unraveled. The quiet town that had trusted Drew Peterson, the smiling police sergeant who waved at neighbors and kept his lawn tidy, now looked at him with suspicion. The autopsy findings confirmed what many had long suspected. Kathleen had not drowned by accident. She had been murdered. Her body showed signs of a struggle, bruises that suggested she'd fought back, and a deep wound on her head that was not consistent with slipping in a bathtub. It was a revelation that changed everything. Investigators now treated the case as a homicide, and the focus immediately turned toward Drew Peterson. He had motive, opportunity, and a long history of controlling behavior toward both Kathleen and his missing fourth wife, Stacy. Still, the road to justice wasn't simple. The death had occurred in 2004, and the original handling of the case left behind gaps in evidence. The local police, many of whom knew Drew personally, had once ruled the death accidental, and now prosecutors had to rebuild the entire case from the ground up. As they reopened the investigation, they started digging into Drew's past. They found a trail of fear and intimidation that stretched across his marriages. His second wife, Vicki Connolly, came forward and told investigators that she, too, had endured years of psychological and physical abuse. She described how Drew would follow her, monitor her phone calls, and threaten her when she tried to leave. Her words painted a consistent picture. Drew Peterson had a pattern of control that turned violent when he felt rejected or challenged. While police worked to strengthen the murder case, the search for Stacy Peterson continued. She had been missing since October 28, 2007, and despite hundreds of volunteers and countless leads, there was still no sign of her. Search teams combed through fields, canals, and forest preserves across Illinois. Helicopters and boats were used to scour areas Drew was known to frequent. Stacy's family, especially her sister Cassandra Callis, became tireless advocates, appearing on television and pleading for information. Cassandra often spoke about how Stacy had confided in her before disappearing, telling her she wanted to leave Drew and feared what he might do if she tried. Meanwhile, Drew seemed unaffected by the chaos around him. He appeared on national television shows like Today and Larry King Live, often smiling and joking, insisting on his innocence. His calm demeanor unsettled people. He made sarcastic remarks about his missing wife, even flirting with interviewers, giving the impression of someone completely detached from the seriousness of the situation. To the public, his behavior felt chilling, almost mocking. Behind the scenes, prosecutors in Will County were building a case that could finally hold him accountable. The turning point came from a new Illinois law, nicknamed Drew's Law. It allowed prosecutors to use certain hearsay statements from a victim if there was evidence that the defendant had made that victim unavailable to testify. Essentially, if Drew had killed Kathleen to silence her. This was crucial because Kathleen had told several people she feared Drew would kill her. Those warnings, once considered mere speculation, now became central pieces of evidence. As investigators pieced together the timeline of Kathleen's final days, the picture grew clearer. Drew and Kathleen were locked in a bitter financial and custody dispute. She had been due to receive a large settlement from the divorce, and Drew had shown growing frustration over losing control of both his money and his family. Friends recalled that Kathleen's fear had become so strong she even changed her locks and told people to check on her if she didn't show up to work. In the days before her death, she told one friend that if anything happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident. By early 2008, the pressure on Drew Peterson was mounting. The reclassification of Kathleen's death as a homicide, combined with the ongoing investigation into Stacy's disappearance, had turned public opinion against him. He was placed under constant surveillance, his movements monitored, and his communications watched. Detectives also re-interviewed officers involved in the original 2004 investigation, questioning why they hadn't pursued the possibility of foul play. The answers were often vague. Some cited lack of evidence. Others said Drew's position as a police officer made it hard to see him as a suspect. That same year, Thomas Morphy, Drew's stepbrother, came forward with shocking details about the night Stacy disappeared. Thomas said Drew had called him to help move a large blue container from his home into Drew's SUV. He described the container as heavy, saying it felt like it contained something the size and weight of a person. The next day, Drew told him to forget about what happened and warned him not to talk. Thomas later became so distraught he was placed under psychiatric observation, but his statement became one of the most critical pieces of information tying Drew to Stacy's disappearance. Despite all this, Drew was still walking free. There was no body in Stacy's case, and until prosecutors were confident they could win, no charges in Kathleen's murder. The public grew impatient. News outlets ran daily stories about him, and Drew seemed to thrive on the attention. He appeared on talk shows, gave interviews from his driveway, and even joked about dating again. In one of his most unsettling appearances, he went on a radio show where the hosts held a win-a-date with Drew Peterson contest. His casual attitude toward his missing wife and dead ex-wife disgusted many, but also drew huge media ratings. By 2009, prosecutors had enough evidence to move forward. On May 7, 2009, Drew Peterson was arrested at a traffic stop near his home. The charge, first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. News cameras captured the moment, and the image of the once proud police sergeant being led away in handcuffs became an unforgettable sight. He was held on a $20 million bond. As officers escorted him, he maintained his usual composure, even smirking at reporters. The arrest electrified the public. For years, people had speculated, doubted, and argued over whether Drew Peterson had gotten away with murder. Now, it looked like justice might finally catch up to him. But the legal battle was only beginning. The pre-trial hearings lasted years. Drew's lawyers were aggressive, arguing that the state's case relied too heavily on hearsay and speculation. They tried to discredit witnesses who said Kathleen had expressed fear, calling those statements unreliable. Prosecutors countered that those very statements painted the most accurate picture of what happened. A woman terrorized by a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. In court, prosecutors described Drew as a man obsessed with control. They presented evidence showing that he had both motive and opportunity. They highlighted inconsistencies in his statements, the unusual handling of the original investigation, and the physical evidence from the second autopsy. Witnesses recounted Kathleen's words in the weeks before her death. One friend testified that Kathleen told her, "If I die, it will be at Drew's hands." Another said Kathleen believed Drew would make her death look like an accident. Those warnings were haunting, especially now that they matched the facts. As the trial date approached, public interest soared. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators. Every new detail, every testimony was covered live. Drew's defense team maintained that there was no direct proof linking him to Kathleen's death. They pointed out there were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no confession. But the prosecution had something equally powerful: years of fear, threats, and patterns of abuse that painted a damning portrait of Drew Peterson's life. Meanwhile, the mystery of Stacy Peterson continued to loom in the background. Her disappearance, though technically a separate case, hung over the courtroom like a shadow. Even without a body, Everyone knew that if Drew could be capable of one murder, he could be capable of two. For Kathleen's family, the trial was their long-awaited chance for closure. For Stacy's, it was a painful reminder that her story was still unfinished. By 2012, after long delays and appeals over what evidence could be used, Drew Peterson finally stood trial. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the Drew's Law provision to include Kathleen's past statements. The defense objected, arguing it violated his rights, but the court allowed much of it. The trial became one of the most closely watched in the country, a rare look into how power and arrogance can corrupt even those sworn to protect the public. As witnesses took the stand and evidence unfolded, Drew sat calmly at the defense table, occasionally whispering to his attorneys. His demeanor, often smirking and confident, unsettled observers. To the jury, it seemed like the same arrogance that had once shielded him as a police officer was still there. The prosecution laid out a clear narrative. Drew Peterson had killed Kathleen Savio to stop her from taking his money, his pride, and his control. The trial stretched for weeks, filled with emotional testimony and sharp legal exchanges. Each detail revealed more about the toxic marriage, the threats, and the violence that had long been hidden behind suburban walls. The evidence was mounting, and the public waited for the moment that would decide whether Drew Peterson's carefully built life would finally collapse. The courtroom in Joliet, Illinois, was silent as the jury filed back in. After years of speculation, media attention, and emotional testimony, the fate of Drew Peterson rested in their hands. It had been a long and exhausting journey to this point, a story that began with the mysterious death of Kathleen Savio in 2004, reignited by the disappearance of Stacy Peterson in 2007, and carried forward by a determined group of investigators and families who refused to give up. Now the trial was about to end, and the question was simple. Would a man who once enforced the law finally be judged by it? The prosecution's closing argument painted Drew Peterson as a man who believed he was above consequence. They said he used his badge not only as a symbol of authority, but as a shield to hide behind. He knew how investigations worked, how evidence could be manipulated, and how to make a murder look like an accident. They reminded the jury that Kathleen Savio's death scene had been suspicious from the start, bruises that didn't match the story, a dry bathtub, and a woman who had predicted her own murder. They emphasized the fear Kathleen had lived in and the timing of her death, coming just before a court date that would have finalized financial losses for Drew. The motive was clear: money, control, and revenge. The defense countered that there was no direct evidence linking Drew to the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses. They claimed the state's case relied on gossip and fear, not facts. They argued that Kathleen's statements about being afraid were emotional, not proof of murder. Drew's lawyers reminded jurors that he had served the community for decades and insisted he was being targeted because of public outrage, not solid evidence. But by then, public patience and sympathy had long run out. The jury wasn't just looking at what was on paper, they were listening to the pattern of his life. When the verdict was read, the room was tense. The foreman's voice broke the silence. Guilty of first-degree murder. A hush swept over the courtroom, followed by quiet gasps and tears from Kathleen's family. Drew Peterson sat motionless for a moment, his confident smirk gone. After years of denials and arrogance, the man who once strutted in front of cameras was finally cornered by justice. Outside, the public's reaction was immediate. After years of watching him dodge suspicion, people felt that justice had finally spoken for Kathleen Savio. In February 2013, Drew Peterson was sentenced to 38 years in prison. At his sentencing, he stood in court and delivered a short, angry statement, shouting that he was innocent and accusing the judge and prosecutors of corruption. His outburst, instead of helping him, only confirmed the image many already had: a man consumed by control, unwilling to take responsibility. The judge called him a dangerous man who had betrayed the trust of the community he once served. When the sentence was announced, Kathleen's family finally felt a measure of peace. Her sister said she can rest now. The aftermath of the trial left deep marks across Illinois. For the Bolingbrook Police Department, It was a stain on their reputation, a painful reminder that one of their own had used the uniform to hide his crimes. For Stacy Peterson's family, the verdict was bittersweet. While Kathleen had received justice, Stacy was still missing. Drew continued to insist that she had run away, but no one believed him. Over time, searches for her body slowed, though every new lead brought her name back into the headlines. Even without a body, investigators and the public believed Stacy's disappearance was Drew's second murder, another attempt to silence someone who knew too much. Life in prison didn't quiet Drew Peterson's ego. In 2015, he was charged again, this time for attempting to hire a hitman to kill James Glasgow, the Will County State's attorney who had prosecuted him. From behind bars, he had tried to arrange the murder through another inmate, promising payment once the job was done. The plot failed, and Peterson was caught on recorded conversations discussing the plan. The evidence was overwhelming, and he was convicted in 2016, adding another 40 years to his sentence. The man who once manipulated everyone around him had finally trapped himself beyond escape. Years later, Drew Peterson remains in prison, serving what is effectively a life sentence. His once polished image as a veteran officer has long vanished. Instead, he's remembered as a symbol of corruption and deceit, a man who believed he could outsmart the system he once represented. The story of Drew Peterson became a national example of how abuse of power and control can turn deadly. It raised questions about how law enforcement handles its own, and how many warning signs were missed before two women paid the price. Kathleen Savio's family has continued to honor her memory. Her two sons, who once lived between their parents' homes, grew up carrying the weight of both loss and public attention. For them, justice brought relief, but not closure. Stacy Peterson's relatives still hold hope that one day her remains will be found, though nearly 2 decades have passed. Her sister Cassandra never stopped speaking out, reminding the public that behind the headlines were real people whose lives were shattered by Drew's actions. The Drew Peterson case revealed the dark side of manipulation, charm, and unchecked authority. He was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a trusted officer, a neighbor, a husband, and a father. His power came from the trust people placed in him, and he used it to control, to silence, and finally, to destroy. What began as a simple tragedy in a suburban bathroom became one of the most haunting true crime stories in modern America. A case that exposed how danger can hide in plain sight. The conviction of Drew Peterson closed one chapter, but left another open. Kathleen Savio's story found justice through persistence, through the voices of those who refused to let her death be forgotten. Stacy Peterson's story remains unfinished, a reminder that truth doesn't always arrive on time, but still matters. In the end, Drew Peterson's downfall was built on the very arrogance that once protected him. The same confidence that carried him through years of lies became the evidence of his guilt. The smirk, the jokes, the interviews, all revealing a man convinced he could never fall. But he did. And in that fall, justice finally found its way home to Bolingbrook. In the summer of 2022, a quiet Virginia suburb became the scene of an unthinkable crime. A retired police officer, a failing marriage, and a moment of deadly rage. What happened inside that Henrico County home? This is the story of Richard Cologne Crowder, and the day everything unraveled. It was a humid July morning in Henrico County, Virginia, when the quiet calm of a suburban neighborhood broke into chaos. The sound of gunfire shattered what should have been an ordinary summer day. What unfolded inside a modest home near Richmond would soon become one of the most shocking domestic tragedies in recent memory. The case of Richard Cologne Crowder, a retired police officer who turned his gun on his estranged wife, Diane Crowder, and her daughter, Carrie Sachs. To the outside world, Richard Crowder appeared like any other man settling into retirement. He was in his early 60s, a former officer who had spent decades upholding the law. Those who had served with him described him as reliable, quiet, and deeply committed to his job. He had been the type who kept his uniform pressed, his reports in order, and his emotions buried. When he left the force, his colleagues expected him to enjoy a quiet life. But behind the calm exterior, cracks had started to show. Retirement had left him restless, and his marriage, already strained by years of distance and resentment, began to crumble. Diane Crowder, in her late 50s, was everything Richard no longer seemed to understand. She was ready for a new beginning. Friends said she was kind, patient, and independent, the kind of woman who smiled through difficult days. For years, she had tried to make her marriage work, but the emotional distance had become unbearable. Richard's temper had grown unpredictable. Arguments had turned into long silences, and those silences had turned into separate lives under the same roof. Eventually, Diane decided she had to leave. Her daughter, 30-something-year-old Carrie Sachs, had watched her mother's unhappiness grow. Carrie was strong-minded, protective, and determined to help Diane start over. She didn't trust Richard's moods, and she worried about how he might react when Diane finally left for good. The two women planned carefully. Diane would move out in stages, taking her things piece by piece, with Carrie by her side. It was supposed to be a simple move, a quiet exit from a marriage that had run its course. But on that fateful day, in July 2022, the tension that had been building for months finally exploded. Neighbors later recalled that the morning began normally. They saw Diane's car parked in front of the house. A moving van came and went. Carrie was there too, helping her mother box up clothes and dishes, wrapping framed photos that once hung proudly in the living room. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken anger. Richard, who had refused to leave the home, watched in silence. Every object packed away seemed to take a piece of his pride with it. Friends would later say that Richard never accepted the idea of Diane leaving. He saw her decision as betrayal, not survival. The thought of losing control, of watching her walk away, ignited something dark inside him. Years of resentment, frustration, and personal decline fused into rage. Around mid-afternoon, voices were raised. A neighbor across the street heard shouting, 2 women, 1 man. Then came a sharp, distinct sound. Gunfire. It was over in seconds. When police were called to the scene, they arrived to chaos. Richard had already barricaded himself inside the house. Through the windows, officers could see movement, a shadow crossing the hallway, the outline of a man armed and unstable. Inside lay the lifeless bodies of Diane and Carrie, each shot multiple times. What had begun as a domestic dispute had turned into a double homicide. As sirens filled the street, the standoff began. Richard, a man who once wore the same badge, now pointed his weapon toward it. He fired at officers who tried to approach. Bullets hit walls and shattered glass, forcing police to take cover. The irony was painful. A retired cop, trained to defuse violence, now creating it. For hours, negotiators pleaded with him to surrender. They reminded him of his years on the force, his oath, his family. But Richard stayed silent, pacing through the same home that had once held family dinners and laughter. While officers secured the perimeter, neighbors were evacuated. Television crews arrived, their cameras trained on the flashing lights, and the line of police vehicles stretching down the block. Reporters described it as a tense and heartbreaking scene. No one could understand how a man who had served his community for decades could end up like this, alone, armed, and surrounded. Behind the police tape, investigators began piecing together what led to the explosion of violence. The story that emerged was one of emotional decay and control. Richard and Diane's marriage had been troubled for years. Friends of the couple said that Diane often spoke of his temper and controlling nature. Retirement had intensified it. Without the structure of police life, Richard's world became smaller, revolving only around the house, the past, and his growing bitterness. When Diane started making plans to leave, it seemed to push him over the edge. Carrie had been aware of the danger. Days before the shooting, she had told a friend that her mother was nervous about facing Richard but wanted closure. She just wants to get her things and move on, Carrie said. Those words, simple and hopeful, would become haunting in hindsight. Inside the barricaded home, time seemed to stretch endlessly. SWAT officers held their positions while negotiators tried to reach him by phone. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then another burst of gunfire. It was clear Richard wasn't ready to give up. Police, aware that Diane and Carrie were already dead, shifted their focus to ending the standoff without more casualties. They used drones to monitor movement, lights to disorient him, and eventually tear gas to force him out. When he finally stepped outside, hours after the first shots, he was no longer the composed officer he once was. His hands shook, his face streaked with sweat, his eyes distant. The man who had spent his life enforcing order now stood at the center of devastation he alone had caused. As he was taken into custody, neighbors watched in disbelief. Some cried. Others just stared silently, unable to process what they had witnessed. The once familiar figure from their quiet street, the man who waved politely during morning walks, was now at the heart of a murder investigation. That evening, police confirmed what everyone feared. Diane Crowder and her daughter, Carrie Sachs, were both dead. Detectives described the scene as disturbing and deeply personal. It was not a random act, they said, but a calculated outburst born from resentment and the inability to let go. In the days that followed, the community struggled to understand. News headlines captured the horror. Retired Virginia officer kills estranged wife and stepdaughter. Former colleagues expressed shock, saying Richard had never shown signs of violence during his career. He was steady, one officer said. You'd never think he was capable of this. But those who knew him at home told a different story, one of tension, bitterness, and a man slowly losing control of his emotions. While investigators gathered evidence, weapons, shell casings, and witness statements, they also uncovered a pattern. Diane had been preparing for the separation for months, moving her finances, planning to change her address, even consulting a lawyer. She had tried to do everything safely, but like many domestic cases, the most dangerous moment came at the end, the moment of leaving. By the end of that week, the house was sealed off as a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the summer breeze, the yard silent except for the low hum of police radios. Behind those walls, a family's history had collapsed into tragedy. For those who had known them, it was impossible to make sense of. Diane's friends remembered her as hopeful, ready for a new chapter. Carrie was described as strong, funny, and always looking out for her mother. Richard was remembered differently, as a man defined by rules and control, whose identity as a police officer had given him purpose. Without it, he seemed to lose his place in the world. In the days following the shooting, Henrico County felt the weight of disbelief. The Crowder home, once another quiet house in a calm Virginia neighborhood, had turned into a symbol of domestic tragedy. Yellow police tape still marked the perimeter while investigators moved in and out, collecting every piece of evidence that could explain what had driven a retired officer to kill his family. Neighbors gathered on porches, still whispering in shock. The story dominated local news, not just because of the crime itself, but because of who had committed it, a man who had once worn the badge and sworn to protect others. Detectives began reconstructing the events that led to the murders. They spoke with relatives, co-workers, and neighbors, trying to understand the relationship between Richard and Diane. What they discovered painted a painful picture of a marriage that had been decaying for years. Richard Crowder's colleagues described him as dedicated but withdrawn, the type of man who lived through his work. After retirement, that purpose vanished. Without the badge, without authority, he became restless. He spent long hours alone at home, his sense of order giving way to frustration. Diane, meanwhile, was ready to find peace. Her daughter Carrie encouraged her to leave and helped her make plans. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It had been building for months. Diane had rented a small apartment across town, packed her things slowly, and kept her distance from Richard, knowing how unpredictable his temper could be. Investigators found that Diane had filed for divorce and had been moving her belongings gradually to avoid confrontation. Friends told police that Richard had been calling her repeatedly, sometimes late at night, pleading one moment and threatening the next. The tone of his voice had shifted from sadness to anger. On the day of the shooting, Diane and Carrie arrived at the house early, hoping to finish before Richard returned. But he was already there. Neighbors recalled seeing his car in the driveway long before the women arrived, as if he had been waiting. Inside the house, the argument escalated quickly. Police would later say that it began in the kitchen and moved toward the hallway. Diane's voice was heard pleading, Carrie shouting for him to calm down. When Richard grabbed his gun, the situation changed from anger to terror. Carrie tried to protect her mother, but there was no time. In seconds, 2 lives were gone. Forensic experts later found that both women had been shot at close range, confirming the killings were personal and deliberate. The standoff that followed lasted several tense hours. Police records described it as chaotic and dangerous. Richard fired multiple times toward officers outside the house, though no one was struck. Negotiators tried every approach they knew. They reminded him of his years in law enforcement, appealed to his training, and urged him to surrender peacefully. But he ignored them. It was as if the man who had once been disciplined and rational had disappeared completely. When tear gas finally forced him out, his face was blank, neither remorseful nor defiant, just empty. After his arrest, Richard was taken to the county jail and held without bond. During initial questioning, he was calm but distant, answering only in short phrases. He admitted to shooting Diane and Carrie, but claimed he didn't plan it. Detectives weren't convinced. The evidence, the loaded handgun, the barricaded doors, the hours of silence before surrender, suggested otherwise. They charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of firing at law enforcement officers. As the legal process began, the story spread beyond Virginia. News outlets across the state ran headlines about the retired cop-turned-killer. For many, it was hard to separate the man from the uniform. How could someone who had spent a lifetime enforcing justice commit such a cruel act? For law enforcement officers who had served with him, it felt like betrayal. He knew better, one former colleague told a reporter. He knew what guns do, what violence does to families. That's what makes it so hard to understand. Meanwhile, Diane and Carrie's friends and relatives gathered to mourn. Their funeral was held quietly in Richmond, attended by dozens of people who spoke of their warmth and kindness. Carrie's co-workers described her as loyal and funny, someone who always stood up for what was right. Diane's close friends remembered her as patient and loving, the kind of woman who believed in forgiveness but had finally decided to choose herself. Their lives had been defined by strength, and their deaths became a painful reminder of how domestic violence can reach even those who believe they're safe. As weeks passed, more details came out about Richard's state of mind. Psychological evaluations revealed signs of deep resentment, depression, and a sense of loss after leaving the police force. He had struggled to adjust to civilian life, missing the structure and authority that once gave him meaning. His marriage's collapse became another blow to his fragile pride. Investigators learned that he had kept his service weapon even after retirement, something common among former officers, but dangerous in unstable hands. The prosecutor's office gathered its case carefully. They planned to show that the murders were not spontaneous, but the result of built-up anger and control. Witness statements showed that Diane had been frightened to return to the house, and that Carrie had warned a friend about her stepfather's behavior days before the incident. Each detail built the image of a man who could not accept losing power over his family. While the investigation moved forward, Richard's defense team began preparing their argument. They hinted at mental decline and emotional instability. They said his years on the force had left him worn down, that he had been under psychological stress. But even his own attorney admitted the evidence was overwhelming. 2 innocent women were dead, and the shooter was caught at the scene. There was no mystery about who had pulled the trigger, only why. Months later, when the case reached pre-trial hearings, Richard appeared frail, older than his years. He spoke little, his eyes fixed on the floor as the charges were read. The courtroom was filled with quiet tension. Members of Diane's and Carrie's families sat in the front rows, holding hands, waiting for some form of justice. Prosecutors described the crime as an act of rage rooted in control and loss, while the defense focused on mental deterioration. The judge ordered a full psychiatric evaluation before trial. By then, the story had moved from headlines to quiet sorrow. Henrico County residents no longer gathered outside the house. The police tape was gone, but the memory lingered. For the community, it wasn't just a crime. It was a reminder of how quickly familiarity can turn into fear, and how years of silence and control can end in sudden destruction. As Richard awaited trial, investigators continued to review his past. They looked for signs of prior violence, old police reports, and any record of domestic incidents. While no formal complaints had been filed, several friends said Diane had mentioned being afraid of his temper, but never wanted to cause trouble. That silence had cost her everything. Months turned into a year as the case of Richard Cologne Crowder moved through the Virginia courts. The courtroom became the stage for a story that still stunned those who followed it. A retired police officer who had turned his weapon against the people he once vowed to protect, his own family. When the trial finally began, the seats were filled with reporters, former colleagues, and residents from Henrico County who couldn't let go of the question that had haunted them since that July afternoon. How did it come to this? The prosecution opened with a simple but devastating statement that the murders of Diane Crowder and her daughter, Carrie Sachs, were deliberate acts of control and rage. They laid out a clear timeline, supported by calls, witness statements, and forensic evidence. Diane had been in the process of leaving her husband. She had filed for divorce and was moving her things out with her daughter's help. Richard knew this, and instead of accepting it, he decided that if he couldn't have his family, no one would. Prosecutors described how he waited for Diane and Carrie to arrive that day, how the argument turned deadly within minutes, and how he fired at officers afterward, showing no concern for the lives he had taken or the danger he posed to others. The defense tried to build sympathy around Richard's mental state. His lawyer described him as a man broken by retirement, loneliness, and depression. They argued that he wasn't thinking clearly, that years of police work and emotional strain had eroded his judgment. A psychologist testified that Richard showed signs of post-traumatic stress and long-term depression, which may have impaired his control at the time of the killings. But as the evidence unfolded, those arguments felt thin compared to the horror of what had happened. The prosecution reminded the jury that Richard had years of training, that he knew how to de-escalate conflict, and that he chose violence anyway. Witnesses added painful details. A neighbor recounted hearing Diane's voice shouting, "Please, don't," followed by a gunshot. Another neighbor described seeing Carrie's car in the driveway that morning and later, hearing bursts of gunfire before police arrived. The responding officers testified about the standoff, how Crowder fired through windows, ignored commands to surrender, and forced them to use tear gas to bring him out alive. Each piece of testimony built a picture of a man consumed by anger, not confusion. As the trial went on, the jury saw photographs from the crime scene, the overturned furniture, the shattered glass, the traces of a family's life destroyed in minutes. They heard recordings of Richard's voice from his interrogation, where he spoke in flat tones, admitting that he had shot Diane and Carrie because, as he put it, "I couldn't let them leave me like that." Those words became the defining moment of the trial. The calmness in his voice erased any notion of temporary madness. It sounded like possession, a man who had already accepted what he had done long before he pulled the trigger. The prosecution closed with quiet force. The lead attorney told the jury, Richard Crowder was not a man who snapped. He was a man who decided. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning their verdict. Richard Cologne Crowder was found guilty on all counts, 2 charges of first-degree murder and multiple charges of using a firearm in the commission of a felony and firing at police officers. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Diane's relatives held each other and cried softly. Crowder sat motionless, staring at the floor, showing no visible reaction. The sentencing phase began shortly after. Prosecutors pushed for life in prison without parole, citing the brutality of the crime and the betrayal of trust from a former officer. The defense asked for leniency based on his age and mental health, arguing that he had already lost everything. In the end, the judge's words were measured but firm. He spoke of duty, responsibility, and the weight of betrayal. "You spent your career protecting the public," the judge said. "But on that day, you became what you once fought against." Richard Crowder was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. He was led out of the courtroom in silence, his head bowed, flanked by deputies who had once called him brother. For Diane and Carrie's loved ones, it wasn't closure, but it was justice. After the trial, the community tried to move forward. The house where the murders happened was sold months later, but few in the neighborhood ever forgot what had occurred there. For many, it remained a haunting reminder of how domestic violence can exist behind closed doors, hidden behind smiles and small talk. Henrico County police officers who had known Crowder struggled with their own emotions, shame, sadness, and disbelief. Some said privately that his case made them more aware of how isolation and anger can build silently, even among those who once lived by order and discipline. In the aftermath, local advocacy groups began using the tragedy as an example in community programs about domestic abuse and mental health awareness. They emphasized the warning signs Diane had tried to manage: control, threats, emotional manipulation, and how leaving can often be the most dangerous moment for victims. Diane's friends worked with one of these programs, hoping her story would help others recognize danger before it turned fatal. As months passed, Crowder's name faded from daily conversation, but the story never truly disappeared. Journalists and documentary producers revisited the case as part of discussions about domestic violence among law enforcement families, examining how authority, control, and personal decline can intersect in destructive ways. For many, the story of Richard Crowder was a tragic study of how a man trained to handle crises failed to handle his own. From a distance, the case seemed straightforward. A man kills his wife and stepdaughter, then faces justice. But underneath that simplicity was a web of loss and emotional collapse. A once respected officer, stripped of purpose, faced the end of his marriage and chose control over compassion. A woman who had finally found the courage to leave paid the ultimate price. And a daughter who stood by her mother's side lost her life for it. In prison, Richard Crowder now spends his days in near silence. He receives few visitors and rarely speaks about the events of that day. Those who have met him describe him as quiet and withdrawn, a man who seems to exist more in memory than in the present. His only statement to the court after sentencing was brief. He said, "I'm sorry," but the words came too late to matter. The story of Richard Cologne Crowder stands as a grim reminder that violence often begins long before the first shot is fired, in years of resentment, control, and silence. It shows how easily a life built on authority can crumble when empathy disappears, and how even those who once upheld the law can fall victim to their own darkness. For Diane and Carrie, their names remain symbols of strength and love, taken too soon by the one person who should have protected them most. And for those who remember that July afternoon in Henrico County, it remains a story that still echoes, a warning that behind the calmest appearances, storms can quietly form until they finally break.